Facebook, before the workplace product rolled out, it was actually the expectation was you should be friends with everyone. And I remember that because I interned at Facebook in 2013. How do you square that away with this other mentality? I mean, perhaps a conflicting mentality of, we're not a family. Work is not a family. We're a professional football team, or, whatever analogy you want to use. And we're coming in to do a job and we're going back home, and, we cut people who don't perform. Do you think that concept of bringing your whole self to work, which is what I think you're describing, and being professionally having high standards, are those at odds with one another?
Yeah, great question. And I think super interesting you asked that, because I think every tech company chooses a different point on the scale to land themselves at. So for instance, Netflix's founder explicitly says, we are not a family. Yeah. If you aren't performing, we will cut you. Like, that is exactly the word that he would use to describe the Netflix mindset, right? When I joined Facebook, I felt like the internal culture was very different from that. It's not that you wouldn't expect performance, because everybody was very high performing, but I think instead it's a mindset as to how you intend to interact. With folks. So when I first joined Facebook, Facebook's average employee age was 27, and Microsoft's average age when I left it was 37. And as you know, from large numbers, like a difference of 10 years in an average is a massive difference when it comes to the employee base, right? And so I feel like one thing that I felt was very different, and for me was invigorating, was this idea of the youthful energy that was behind Facebook. People were much more willing to hang out after work, for instance. There was a lot more natural intermixing. You mentioned being an intern at one point. I mean, internships are social in that exact beautiful way, right? Mm-hmm. Is that people are doing things outside of work together. They're doing things on weekends together. So I feel like when I first joined Facebook, that idea of a super tight-knit community that's socially well-knit together as well as professionally was kind of normal and par for the course. But as Facebook grows, as any company matures, and especially as the median age goes up in any company, that naturally needs to taper back a bit as people have outside commitments with family, with friends outside and whatnot. And so I do think that shifted at Facebook, in my perception, over time, as well as it naturally should.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a function, I think, of the employee base getting older. I also wonder how much of it has to do with how big the company is. So, for example, you were employee number 2 in the Seattle branch of Facebook. And then you actually started at the engineering office in London for Facebook. And so you were in these kind of microcosms where you were literally like the first person on the ground. But at the same time, Facebook as a company grew, I imagine, from like a couple hundred people when you joined to 20,000 plus when you left in 2018, right? So do you feel like there's a point where you just can't expect that level of openness anymore?
Yeah, totally. Like, if you imagine, like, when I left Microsoft, its peak employee base back then was 130,000 people, which is larger than the populations of 40 countries in the world. Right. So if you imagine an entire country, you know what I mean? Having discussions, having social discussions, that would be crazy, right? So like, you have to realize the scale at which we're talking about things. So A, I think you're absolutely right. But B, I think there's also an interesting inbound selection bias, which is this. When I joined Facebook, only a certain type of engineer would want to join a social networking company. That tended to be the type of person who did believe that the world would be better connected, that we could digitally connect with people far away in a meaningful way, right? And so sort of, I think there's a kind of a bias toward that, where right now, given the size of Facebook, that may no longer be as consistent, in that once a company gets to such a large scale, there are people who can work on infrastructure, let's say, that don't really have a deep passion for connecting people necessarily. They have a deep passion for massively distributed, architectures, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think not only do they not maybe have the passion in the product sense, but also the incentives may not be aligned, right? Like, kind of inherently, when you have a company that large, you might actually get to the point where, me hitting my goals on this team may not be aligned, or may negatively correlate with you hitting your goals on this team.
Right.
And so I feel like that's kind of the classic, big company problem